Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out for another night of C.S. Lewis. Hey, y'all. The Pursuit of Joy. We're gonna jump in here as we've done every Thursday night. Really, picking up where we left off the week before. This has been sort of a continuation of a narrative, a continuation of a story. Lewis, the great storyteller, of course. This is in many ways his story. And if there's ever been a night where I feel like I'm having to compress details and leave things out, it's tonight. And I was sharing with someone earlier, in some ways tonight's sort of a dark season for Lewis. And you'll see why as we make our way through it. My daddy was in World War II in the Pacific. And he was in the Pacific Theater. He was part of a 3-man anti-aircraft gun. It's the primary reason that he had severely impaired hearing. For all my memories of him, for me, it's because I played in rock bands back when I was younger. And in those days, what was more important than anything was how big and how loud your guitar amp was. In fact, one of the bands I was in, the drummer complained that he could not hear the drums that he was playing right in front of him because of how loud my amp needed to be. And so that's why I can't hear thunder today. But my daddy was in World War II, and there's a sense in which the war defined my daddy. Perhaps you have parents or grandparents for whom this is the case. And so because that I have relatively more knowledgeability of World War II than I do World War I. In fact, when we went to London last year, we made a beeline for the Churchill War Rooms and spent several hours there. And you have to spend several hours. I mean, probably 2 or 3 days. You could only begin to scratch the surface. One of my favorite things that I discovered there was Churchill had this series of fuchsia velvet jumpsuits made up. And I'm telling you right now, if I could get my hands on one of those, that's all you'd ever see me in, is a fuchsia velvet jumpsuit. You got pockets for his cigars, everything he needed right there. But that was actually his jumpsuit on display there. Every time I speak at Hillsdale College, I manage to cajole my wife into letting me pick out a couple of volumes of the Churchill papers. But there's a sense in which, as we discussed Tollers and Jack last week, and I talked about how they both were so impacted by the Great War. There's really no way to understand Tolkien or Lewis and their work apart from World War I. Now, time prevents me from delving into this at any length, into this dynamic at any length. I would highly recommend Joseph LeConte's book, A Hobbit, a Wardrobe, and a Great War, because in that book you begin to see just how, not only for them as men for the rest of their lives, but how World War I figured into their work. This book would make a great Christmas gift for yourself. Ken will have these in the store. I don't think we have any on the table tonight, but you can definitely go to Ken. He can get you a copy of this book. It'd be a great Christmas present for yourself. But all of the great epic battle scenes in Middle-earth trace back to Tolkien's time in the Battle of the Somme. You look at the great battle in the last battle in Chronicles of Narnia, and that traces back to Lewis's time in the war. You'll recall, I think it was probably the first or second night, we talked about how Lewis kept shrapnel in his chest for the remainder of his life until toward his latter years, when the pain was such he had to have it surgically removed. And so he carried in his body, right, the evidence of his time in the Great War. Well, I got to compress a lot of things tonight, as I said, but I want to draw our attention to the way in which World War II impacted the life of Jack. A book like this lets you know just how impactful World War I was on Jack and Tollers, but what about World War II? And I would even make the claim that World War II, in a sense, gave us C.S. Lewis as we have him now in the wide world. When the war broke out on September 1st, 1939, Jack ended up receiving 19 displaced young ladies into the kilns. Now, last week we were blessed to have a man named John here, who, remember, he read a passage from Lewis in that beautiful British accent, and I really did not want to even take the microphone after that. It was so lovely to hear him read a passage from Lewis. But he lives 4 miles from the kilns, he said. If you've been, how many of you have been to the kilns? Anyone in here has been to the kilns? It's not I know you have, baby. I saw you over there. Yeah. Yeah. It's not a massive structure. And so you think you got Jack living there, Warnie, his brother, living there. There were a couple of gardeners who lived there. Minto, Mrs. Moore, much to Warnie's chagrin, lived there. And now you add about 20 more people into the kilns because these young women were displaced. They were having to get people out of London, and they were just, taking people wherever they could to get them to a place of relative safety. Warnie was called back into service, and thus began the new normal. Jack was 40 and unlikely to be called into service because the British government had said that they wouldn't take anyone beyond the age of 41. They were taking a lot of freshman young men from Oxford and other universities. The British government ended up taking over all of the rooms at Magdalen College. Remember, Magdalen College was where Lewis had his rooms. It's where he taught. And so they came in and said, we're going to have to commandeer all of the rooms at Magdalen College to, complete the war effort here and have offices and space to conduct the war. And so all of Jack's books had to be taken out of his rooms and put down in the cellar. Now, one of the interesting things, Lewis had a massive library, as you might imagine, but at no point in his life until toward the end were all of his books in one location. I can feel his pain there. But they take his books from the rooms down to the cellars, and no sooner did they do that than the British government decided they didn't, in fact, need Magdalen College. They had to all be brought back up and returned to his rooms. Jack joined the Home Patrol. He didn't end up going back into the service, but he joined the Home Patrol there in Oxford, and he would begin his day at about 1:30 a.m. every morning, just patrolling the area, patrolling the environs around Magdalen College and other areas there in Oxford. He wrote a letter to Warnie at this time. Warnie again has gone off into the service. He informs him of the newest member of the Inklings, Charles Williams, 1886 to 1945. Now, we talked a lot about the Inklings last week, so I'm not going to say much about the Inklings as a group tonight. I'll say a couple of things. But the introduction of Charles Williams was something that was very important for Lewis because of just how godly and how spiritual Charles Williams actually was. I have some of his writings back here, and Lewis was quite enamored with Charles Williams, a man that Lewis nonetheless described as, quote, an ugly man with a rather cockney voice, but no one thinks of this for 5 minutes after he's begun speaking. His face becomes almost angelic, he said. Both in public and private, he is of nearly all the men I have met, the one whose address most overflows with love. So Jack is trying to keep Warnie in the loop on the meetings of the Inklings, writing him letters on the front, letting him know what they're discussing in their gatherings on Thursday nights and their gatherings on Tuesdays during lunchtime. He sends him a letter in which he tells his brother that Charles Williams read to them from his latest play on the Nativity of Hugo Dyson. You remember we talked about Hugo Dyson. Dyson was a Shakespeare scholar, you'll recall. He was one of the men who, along with J.R.R. Tolkien, walked with Lewis around Addison's Walk and shared the gospel with him. And Lewis would tell Arthur Greeves, his dear friend back in Ireland, the first person he told about his conversion was Arthur Greeves. And he said that walk that night with Tollers and Dyson had a lot to do with it. Well, of Hugo Dyson, at one of their meetings, he lets Warnie know, I have never in my life seen Dyson so exuberant, a roaring cataract of nonsense. Love that. J.R.R. Tolkien read a new section from a little book you may have heard of, The Hobbit. And so what's going on in these meetings of the Inklings? They were just sharing their work as it was in process. There's a story from one of their meetings in which Hugo Dyson had enough hearing Tollers read from his work, and he interrupted, and I want to be delicate in the way that I say this, he interrupted the meeting, slams down his beer and says, oh no, please don't tell me another It begins with the letter that comes after the letter E, and not just another freaking hobbit. We'll leave it that way. And he was not a huge fan of The Hobbit. He was not a huge fan of Middle Earth. And if you've read Tolkien, you know that he can write page after page after page after page describing something that most people would describe in maybe a few short sentences. One of the things I actually love about Tolkien is that when you read him, you can't read Tolkien. Nobody should think about speed reading The Lord of the Rings. I mean, you might think about that, but after about 2 chapters in, you realize this is just not going to work out. No speed reading course is going to help you with The Lord of the Rings. You need to luxuriate in the detail. That's part of the charm of the Lord of the Rings. I was reading a passage the other night where he talks about as Frodo and his boys are out beginning their journey, he says, "In the morning the grass was gray with dew," or gray with cold dew. And I've never thought to myself, but yeah, you look at green grass and when it's covered with dew, there's kind of a gray sheen to it. Only Tolkien would think to describe it that way. The grass was gray with cold dew. Anyway, Dyson had enough, didn't want to hear anything more about hobbits. At this same meeting that Jack writes to Warning about, he says that he read to the group, the first chapter of a very important book, The Problem of Pain. He began writing this book in the summer of 1939, and he published it in 1940. Its opening words are, quote, "Not many years ago when I was an atheist, ... Thus, in a very real sense, this, what's considered his major war work, began Jack's real public persona as a public intellectual, as a public apologist. How many of you have read The Problem of Pain? That's something that y'all have read. Brad Bull and I were sharing last week, and I've asked him just to share his heart here about the book, The Problem of Pain. Now, this book begins Lewis's, as I said, his public intellectual life for all intents and purposes. And there are going to be implications of this for him as an individual, for his career at Oxford, and we're going to get into that. But The Problem of Pain struck a chord with people. It struck a chord because here was somebody, as he would later say, translating the gospel, translating the Christian worldview at the precise point where people were feeling their need the most. And remember, what's the context? The war has begun. There is rationing. There is death. People are receiving letters from the front that their loved ones are not going to be returning. And so The Problem of Pain strikes a chord not only for Jack as an apologist, but in many ways as the sort of the embryonic pastoral voice that he was developing for an entire nation. And so I've asked Brad just to share. Brad, why don't you come up here and just that way we can get you on camera. Come up and share a little bit about why this book matters so much to you. This is probably the most special thing that you're going to hear in all of our 5 weeks together.
Thanks, David. I'm going to try and make this fast so I don't take away from any of David's time. But I was writing a paper. I was finishing up a paper in school for a degree, and the title of my paper was "Why Bad Things Happen to Good People." And so I gravitated towards C.S. Lewis, Problem of Pain, A Grief Observed, and some other things, and I read them. And I was sharing with my son, Jedediah, that means beloved of God, by the way. And he was my redhead. He was 17 years old. And I'm going to just, if it's okay, I'll just read this little thing because I've got in the margin here. It says, I read this to Jed on 8/2/25 or 20. The day before he died. He was killed by a drunk driver the next day. So I'll read to you what I read to him, and him and I were having this discussion because he was struggling with some things. And I said, well, Jed, listen to this. And C.S. Lewis makes reference to the war just previous to this, but he says, "My own experience is something like this. I'm progressing along the path of life in my ordinary, contentedly fallen and godless condition, absorbed in merry meeting with my friends for the morrow or a bit of work that tickles my vanity today, a holiday or a new book, when suddenly a stab of abdominal pain that threatens serious disease, or a headline in the newspapers that threatens all us with destruction, sends this whole pack of cards tumbling down. At first I'm overwhelmed, and all my little happinesses look like broken toys. Then slowly and reluctantly, bit by bit, I try to bring myself into the frame of mind that I should be at all times. I remind myself that all these toys were never intended to possess my heart, that my true good is in another world, and my only real treasure is Christ. And perhaps by God's grace, I succeed for a day or two to become the creature consciously dependent on God and drawing its strength from the right sources. But the moment that the thread is withdrawn, my whole nature leaps back to the toys. I'm even anxious, God forgive me, to banish from my mind the only thing that supported me under the threat, because it is now associated with the misery of those few days. Thus, the terrible necessity of tribulation is only too clear. God has had me but for 48 hours, and then only by dint of talking or taking everything else away from me. Let him but sheath the sword for a moment, and I behave like a puppy. When the hated bath is over, I shake myself as dry as I can and race off to reacquire my comfortable dirtiness. If not in the nearest manure heap, at least in the nearest flower bed. And that is why tribulations cannot cease until God either sees us remade or sees that our remaking is now hopeless." So I read that to Jed the next day. He was gone, but that night, I believe he wrote this, and this was a wallet that was on his person that they gave to me. It was a horrible experience in a Ziploc bag. Hope nobody ever has to go through that. But in this little fold, and this is the real deal here, this is his paper. It's probably one of the more precious things I own or have, and it's written in his own writing. I believe without a doubt that he wrote that after our conversation, or wrote this, and this is what he said. He said, "God, please forgive me of my sins and help me get my life on track. I need you, God. Please help the ones I love forgive me. God, I accept your judgment and will in my life. I accept that all that I receive with a willing heart and with no anger or frustration, for I know that all for I know that all that happens is your will. Let God's will be done. Let your will be done in my life, God. Please help me get my life in order so I can serve you. In Jesus' name, amen." That probably saved my life right there. It was a blessing, and I can't thank C.S. Lewis enough. This was timely, it was providential in my life, and it's just had a massive impact. And many, many people have heard this letter and heard this story. So God bless C.S. Lewis. Yeah.
Brad, thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. You can see why Lewis means so much, that we get out on Thursday nights like this and come just to think and process with each other things we've read, things that we've loved, ways that Lewis has saved us, as it were, things that he has written. I mean, next week, I told you I want you to be prepared by, if you can, having read A Grief Observed. We're going to discuss A Grief Observed next Thursday night, the way that we're going to discuss the weight of glory tonight. But this book, The Problem of Pain, again, it was his major war work. And he writes it in the summer of 39, publishes it in 40, as the war is really getting underway. And you can imagine the impact of the problem of pain as people are receiving dire news, heartbreaking news. And for Brad to share with us the way that this book, I mean, that very book right there is probably one of the most precious books in your library, is that very one. Well, this begins, as I said, Jack's public persona as a public intellectual, as an apologist. Now, to understand Jack as an apologist, to understand C.S. Lewis's writings, we need to understand a couple of things. One is the sort of transatlantic context of Jack, and we'll get into that in a minute. What does it mean that Jack was received in America, and why was he so celebrated in America? But we have to understand the British context in which Jack found himself and was writing, and the context in which his conversion was really taking root, in which he was growing in Christ. And so the British context is one of philosophical modernism through the prophets of modernity, such as Friedrich Nietzsche, Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Emil Durkheim, and a handful of others. They joined in with higher biblical critics to produce a trenchant agnosticism at best in England. And Jack, no doubt, had a belly full of the writings of people like Nietzsche and Darwin and Marx under the tutelage of, you remember, Mrs. Kirkpatrick, that hardened atheist, quasi-spiritualist, really under whose tutelage Jack's atheism became, as he would later say, hard-boiled atheism. But all of England had been taken captive in large part by the work of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. He lived from 1710 to 1831. Now this is a little bit of a deep into the pool just for a couple of minutes. Hegelianism, then as now, is a form of what is called philosophical absolute idealism. And idealism is a philosophical school which held that there is no triune God, there's no Father God looking over us, there's no divine Jesus Christ, but rather what unites us all and what is the sort of meta-narrative is this all-encompassing impersonal absolute, or this all-encompassing impersonal idea. There's no need for historical Christianity. Now, the British idealist school, represented by figures such as T.H. Green, F.H. Bradley, and particularly Bernard Bosanquet, were uniquely influential on Lewis during his transition to atheism. You'll remember back in the early 1920s. The absolute is an impersonal idea that is eminently present in all men, all things, and it forms a sort of pantheistic cosmology, a sort of pantheistic metaphysic. This idea, this absolute, was there in every man, and yet it's impersonal. And it's in all of us. It is not outside of us, making any demands upon any of us. As Jack would say in chapter 13 of Surprised by Joy, if you've read it, the absolute would never come here. It would, quote, never, to be blunt, Jack says, make a nuisance of itself. And so what the intelligentsia had done in England, all of the philosophers and the theologians and the thinkers and so forth, all of the professor class, as it were, and what this had sort of trickled down into the man on the street, is that there is no personal God who makes any demands of you. There is no God as such. There is, however, a meta-narrative. There is an absolute, again, absolute idealism, but that absolute is in all of us. It is something that permeates all of us. And so it sort of formed as I said, a pantheism. Now, I was telling a group of students earlier, right in this very room, we had a group of 5 students who portrayed various historical characters in political thought today. And we had one who portrayed Clarence Thomas. There was Carly Fiorini, Condoleezza Rice. There was, I think I said Clarence Thomas, Friedrich Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher, 1844 to 1900. And afterwards, I was talking with the students and was sharing how I think in many ways, European history in the 1800s, which produced, say, a Friedrich Nietzsche, and even what we're dealing with today as we transition from modernism to postmodernism, now to metamodernism, really is in some ways a result of the French Revolution of the 1790s, because after the French Revolution of the 1790s, you have an entire century of European self-consciousness, of European self-awareness, trying to make sense of, on the one hand, materialistic Darwinian atheism, and yet there's this spiritual core in man that can't be denied. And so you sort of go off into the ditch of kind of a Gnostic pagan spiritualism. And so for 100 years, Europe kind of vacillates back and forth between evolutionary thinking, Darwinianism, materialistic atheism, and yet this sort of spiritual quest. Well, what filled in the gap very nicely is this spiritual idea of an impersonal absolute permeating all of us. And at the end of the day, it was simply, same song, different verse of pantheism. Now, as an aside, my own doctoral work in the theology of Cornelius Van Til deals with Bosanquet's idealism, as Van Til's own doctoral thesis when he was a young man was God in the Absolute, and he spent the rest of his career at Westminster Theological Seminary using idealist nomenclature to turn idealism on its head in submission to the reality of the absolute, self-contained ontological Trinity. In other words, the absolute is not an impersonal idea in you and me, so that ultimately we are the absolute. You and I are the absolute. The absolute is the personal, ontological, triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Anyway, Lewis functioned as an atheist and then later as a Christian in a Britain that was awash in what was called in the divinity schools of Oxford and Cambridge a, quote, reduced Christianity. A reduced Christianity in which things like the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, the inspiration, trustworthiness of the Bible, miracles, etc., were dismissed as superstitious and antiquated thinking. Even such, popular stalwarts as G.K. Chesterton, we talked some about him the last couple of weeks, was scoffed at in this regard. Poet T.S. Eliot, you may be familiar with T.S. Eliot, 1888 to 1965, one of my favorite poets, was himself an atheist. He was a member of the Bloomsbury Group. You may be familiar with the Bloomsbury Group of authors such as Keynes and Woolf, etc., Virginia Woolf. In fact, I'm here, you probably are familiar with Eliot's Wasteland. Have you read The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot? It really is the sort of preeminent example of modernist poetry. Here I am at his birthplace and his teenage home in St. Louis. This is where he was born. The house is gone now, but behind this fence is where his house stood. And then this is where he lived for a year at 16 years of age before he goes off to boarding school. And then later he leaves the States and moves over to England, and he takes up British citizenship. Well, again, he was part of the Bloomsbury Group. He himself was an atheist, and he fit in quite nicely with the intelligentsia of his day. That is, until he was baptized and received into the Church of England in 1927. Now, Lewis and Eliot would later become friends. In 1961, they even worked together on the styling of the Revised Psalter for the Book of Common Prayer. Jack, of course, having done his reflection on the Psalms. I have actually a first British edition of Reflections on the Psalms there in my library. He had just done that in 1957. And then just a few short years later, he works with T.S. Eliot on the styling of the Psalter for the Book of Common Prayer. But to give you a picture of the sort of moral, academic, spiritual climate in which Lewis found himself when Eliot converted to Christianity back in 1927. And so what does that tell us? Tom Eliot becomes a Christian just a couple of years really before Lewis does. But when T.S. Eliot becomes a Christian, Virginia Woolf, perhaps some of you are familiar with Virginia Woolf, the queen of feminist modernist writers, Orlando to the Lighthouse, Mrs. Dalloway, A Room of One's Own, which is considered a feminist manifesto. She was a member of the Bloomsbury Group. She wrote to a friend on February 11th, 1928. Listen to this. I have had a most shameful and distressing interview with dear Tom Eliot. who may be called dead to us all from this day forward. He has become an Anglo-Catholic believer in God and in immortality, and he goes to church. I was shocked. A corpse would seem to be more credible than he is. I mean, there's something obscene in a living person sitting by the fire and believing in God. Now, perhaps some of you are familiar with the writings of Virginia Woolf. She's an incredible stylist, an important author of the last century, and certainly in terms of feminist literature, you can't ignore Virginia Woolf. But her revulsion at dear Tom Elliot, who was a treasured member of the Bloomsbury Group, she said, he is dead to us now. A corpse has more credibility than T.S. Eliot. As brilliant and as talented as Eliot was and is, if you read Eliot, you would understand, and yet she's so embittered over his conversion, she says a corpse would have more credibility. She was disgusted. Sadly, Virginia Woolf would fall into a Great Depression at the onset of World War II, and on March 28th, 1941, she loaded her pockets with heavy stones and walked into the River Ouse and drowned herself in its fast-flowing waters, and her body was not found until 3 days later. It was in this cultural moment that C.S. Lewis emerged as an apostle to the skeptic in Britain. It was hard on him at what he called big, brutal maudlin. He became popular to people who needed encouragement in their Christian faith. He became popular for people who were becoming converted because of his writings. As we're going to see, his fame spread like wildfire in the States, and yet in Oxford at big, brutal maudlin, he became something of an embarrassment. How can you be a serious scholar and believe these things, much less write about these things? He described his journey from being a, quote, hard-boiled atheist in 1943's The Pilgrim's Regress. I think I was talking with someone in here for whom Pilgrim's Regress was their favorite work by Lewis. He describes his journey from being a hard-boiled atheist in 1943's The Pilgrim's Regress thusly. Listen, on the intellectual side of my own progress had been from popular realism to philosophical idealism, from idealism to pantheism, from pantheism to theism, and from theism to Christianity. Now, he was known mainly in Oxford at this point for his conversion to Christianity. His fame had not spread. And yet there in Oxford, to be someone who is public with your faith in Christ, it really was the kiss of death. In fact, T.S. Eliot would later say, quote, it's quite apparent that anybody in an Oxford college, if they wish to escape detection, the one place for them to go is to the chapel. Nobody's going to find you there, right? Nobody's going to find you. Nobody goes to chapel. Lewis's problem was that he distinguished himself from all the liberal theologians at Oxford in believing that Christianity was objective historical fact. In The Weight of Glory that we'll consider here in just a little bit, he writes, quote, if our religion is something objective, then we must never avert our eyes from those elements in it which seem puzzling or repellent. For it will be precisely the puzzling or the repellent which conceals what we do not yet know and need to know. In Christian Apologetics, which is an essay in chapter 10 of God in the Dock, probably if you say, what are the collections of essays that I need to get by Lewis? What's a good Lewis starter kit? I want to read some essays. God in the Dock and The Weight of Glory are two good collections of essays. But chapter 10 of God in the Dock is an essay entitled Christian Apologetics. And he says this, quote, Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. In his Repellent Doctrines, which was a series of talks that he gave at the Oxford Socratic Club in the 40s and 50s, he said, In the same way, there will be progress in Christian knowledge only as long as we accept the challenge of the difficult or repellent doctrines. A liberal Christianity, which considers itself free to alter the faith whenever the faith looks perplexing or repellent, must be completely stagnant. Progress is made only into a resisting material. What are repellent doctrines? Well, the virgin birth, the divinity of Christ, miracles, the trustworthiness of the Bible, the doctrine of the Trinity, the necessity of salvation to have eternal life. I remember when I was in college, and I started back in 1984, and I was doing a Christian education degree in the denominational college in the denomination in which I was raised. Most of my professors were Bardian professors who had done their PhDs at Southern Seminary when Barth and Bultmann were all the rage there. And I'll never forget, within the first couple of weeks of class, one of my professors said to me, "David, you must learn to have a genuine enough faith that can remain genuine without having to accept biological impossibilities like a bodily resurrection from the dead or a virgin birth." So I was hit with this as a young man. Lewis is saying, when you have a liberal Christianity that feels free to alter the perplexing, to alter the repellent doctrines, you're going to have stagnation. He was criticized for the vulgarity in his books. Now, not vulgarity the way that my mom used to tell me if I was using bad language, "Oh, you're just being vulgar." Not that. What is meant, criticism for the vulgarity in his books, was how intellectually unbecoming his writings about repellent doctrines actually are to the sophisticated man. And so he writes in a rejoinder to Dr. Pittenger, quote, "When I began, Christianity came before the great mass of my unbelieving fellow countrymen, either in the highly emotional form offered by the revivalists or in the unintelligible language of highly cultured clergymen. Most men were reached by neither. My task was therefore simply that of a translator, one turning Christian doctrine, or what he believed to be such, into the vernacular, into language that unscholarly people would attend to and could understand." Now, so much could be said of his writings during these years. We're going to consider in a bit the sermon from June 8, 1941 at the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin, The Weight of Glory. And so I want to make my way through the rest of this so that we have time to really process together and think through things that really stood out to you as you read that sermon. But at this time, the demand for him to speak at gatherings, the Royal Air Force, various societies, even to the nuns of the Sisters of the Community of St. Mary the Virgin, which is one of the oldest Anglican religious orders since the Reformation in England. And this is the church here, the Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Oxford. There's the actual pulpit from which he preached the weight of glory. But he's getting invitations to speak now. And his reputation as a Christian thinker, as an apologist, as one who could help people think through their questions and their hang-ups with Christianity was spreading. And people were reading a series of weekly installments in the UK newspaper called The Guardian. And these weekly installments, for which he was paid £2 apiece, were about an uncle devil writing to his younger nephew, Junior Devil. You may have heard of a little book called what? The Screwtape Letters. During the war years, he was also invited to give a series of talks by the BBC. 5 talks on what Christians believe, January to February of 1942. 8 talks on Christian behavior, September to November of 1942. And 7 talks on beyond personality, February to April of 1944. He gave these talks traveling back and forth from Oxford to London during the air raids and the bombings. You can actually access talks number 2 and 6 and 7 on YouTube. And I thought what might be kind of fun, if I can rig this up here, is some of you perhaps have never heard, you've never heard C.S. Lewis. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take just a quick second here, and we are going to listen to just a bit, for the sake of time, just a bit of C.S. Lewis.
Going on to my main subject tonight, I'd like to deal with the difficulty some people find about the whole idea of prayer. Somebody put it to me by saying, I can believe in God all right, but what I can't swallow is this idea of him listening to several 100 million human beings who are all addressing him at the same moment. And I find quite a lot of people feel that difficulty. Well, the first thing to notice is that the whole sting of it comes in the words, at the same moment. Most of us can imagine a God attending to any number of claimants if only they come one by one, and he has an endless time to do it in. So what's really at the back of the difficulty is this idea of God having to fit too many things into one moment of time. Well, that of course is what happens to us. Our life comes to us moment by moment. One moment disappears before the next comes along, and there's room for precious little in each. That's what time is like. And of course, you and I tend to take it for granted that this time series, this arrangement of past, present, and future, isn't simply the way life comes to us, but is the way all things really exist. We tend to assume that the whole universe and God himself are always moving on from a past to a future, just as we are. But many learned men don't agree with that. I think it was the theologians who first started the idea that some things are not in time at all. Later, the philosophers took it over, and now some of the scientists are doing the same. Almost certainly, God is not in time. His
So that's just a sample there, and I want to commend you to go on YouTube. You can do a very simple search for C.S. Lewis, and you're going to find 3 examples that we have, and it's actually all that we have. You actually can also obtain a set of CDs of recordings. You can actually stream this as well of him reading the 4 loves. But what you just heard is an example of what I was talking about when he was being invited by the BBC to come into London from Oxford and give these talks. Now, why was this something that they wanted? They knew that people were living in utter fear and desperation. There were bombing raids over London at the time, and people needed something to give them some sense of hope. And so his reputation for being someone who could speak at the Socratic Society or to a group of nuns or to a group of students in Oxford reaches the attention of the BBC. Screwtape Letters is out in serial form in the newspaper, and so they tap him to come. The earliest collection of these talks were published as broadcast talks. This is actually exactly what you would have picked up at the little bookstall at the train station in London at the time. This is a first edition of broadcast talks. That, of course, material is all conglomerated and becomes a book with which many of you are familiar, Mere Christianity. It's these radio talks on the BBC that are collated and published and turned into the book that has probably resulted in terms of a book resulting in people converting to Christ, probably unparalleled. This is actually an American first. For you, is it, Jimmy? It was Mere Christianity? Incredible.
Turn me on my living room floor,
Oh, I love it.
page 40.
Oh, my goodness.
Christ, the perspective on Christ as a liar, lunatic, or the Son of God.
Yeah. The trilemma, he is either... So tell us what is the trilemma? What is the Lord, liar, lunatic, Jimmy? Tell us what that is. Some of us may not be familiar with Lord, liar, lunatic. What is it in a nutshell?
It is the idea that we have a lot of liberal folk who would hold a perspective that Christ is very honorable and good. And C.S. Lewis said he did not give us that option.
Yeah.
Because he called himself divine. Thus, if he was not, he was a liar. And And there's also the perspective, well, was he delusional? A lunatic. And if it was not, then he was what he said he was, the Son of God. And I fell on my knees and said, this could be true.
Praise the Lord. The one option that he didn't leave us is that he was simply a good man, because if he's a liar, good men don't lie. If he's a lunatic, lunatics aren't good moral guides. And so the one option we don't have is this patronizing nonsense of the liberal theologians of Lewis' day and ours, that Jesus was simply a good moral guide or a good moral teacher. And as Jimmy discovered, he indeed was exactly who he said he was. He was Lord. And so we're actually going to be discussing Mere Christianity and what I would call the biography of Mere Christianity. How did Mere Christianity come about? And next semester, we'll make our way through over a course of a couple of weeks, and we'll discuss together Mere Christianity. Next semester is going to be a little less of me lecturing and more of like a reading group where we discuss together and learn from one another's readings of Mere Christianity and the Ransom Trilogy and Narnia. But he's giving these talks on the BBC. You heard a bit of one of them there. While these talks are being given and going out over the radio waves, there are air raids, there are bombings. People are holding on to hope. And it's these radio talks by C.S. Lewis that are getting people's attention. Again, we'll be looking at Mere Christianity next semester, so I'm not going to belabor it here. But Lewis was, in many ways, the evangelist of his day, even though he did not see himself as such. Remember Christian Apologetics, chapter 10 of God in the Dock? He says, where a speaker has that gift, the direct evangelical appeal of come to Jesus, that can be so overwhelming today as it was 100 years ago. I cannot do it, he says, but those who can ought to do it with all their might. I am not sure that the ideal missionary team ought not consist of one who argues and one who, in the fullest sense of the word, preaches. Put up your arguer first to undermine their intellectual prejudices, then let the evangelist proper launch his appeal. Probably some wisdom to that. As modest payments started rolling in for the Screw Tape installments from The Guardian, again, £2 per letter, as well as his radio talk, started getting some royalty from that, he insisted that these payments be sent anonymously to a list of widows that he had compiled, not realizing that these donations that he was making, because he was taking basically 2/3 throughout all of his life, 2/3 of his income and the money he made off of his writings and his speaking went to charity. And yet when he set up this list of widows and was giving all of that money to this list of widows, he wasn't thinking he was going to be taxed on that as well. So he had given 2/3 of his income away, and the tax on it, he couldn't quite afford it, left with only 1/3 of what he had kept for himself. And so you may recall Owen Barfield. We talked about him last week. Owen Barfield was not simply a poet and a writer. He was also a solicitor. And so he took up the defense for his friend Jack, and he established a charitable trust, the Agape Fund, or as they called it, Agapagiri, love plus money, which until his marriage in 1957, about which we'll say more next week, sent 2/3 of his royalties to those in need. Again, he never saw a significant financial benefit from his increasing sales. Never. In fact, toward the end of his life, he was worried about how he was going to be able to pay for keeping Mrs. Moore in a nursing home in her last year of life. He was worried always about becoming destitute because he gave so much of his money to charity. Jack's friendship with Dorothy Sayers, we mentioned her last couple of weeks. It grew during this period. They were corresponding more and more. Life at the Kilns was filled with the challenges of caring for Miss Moore, along with all the stranded schoolgirls and others who would end up taking refuge in the Lewis homestead. Mrs. Moore was regularly sick. Warney complained in the book Brothers and Friends, which is long out of print. I have a first edition of it right here. You can go online and you can find this for anywhere between $170 to about $250. It's out of print. I got it for $3. I just love it when that happens. But he says in this book, which is a collection of his diary entries, Warney is complaining about the burden that Mrs. Moore is. And he says in that book, Brothers and Friends, here is a woman, this is it's honestly kind of funny. Here is a woman who has been, if not at death's door, at least at its front gate. And the very minute returning strength enables her to do so, she is hard at work, building up again the flame of her envy, hatred, and malice. Of course, Jack had to contend with Warney's increasing chronic alcoholism. Now, rationing during these years was significant, even in post-war Oxford. Again, I'm compressing a lot of time here. But post-war Oxford rationing made life difficult, to say the least. The Guardian commissioned Lewis for a new series of weekly installments that would become one of his greatest literary achievements, The Great Divorce. He wrote a number of other articles and essays during this time, one that I think is particularly relevant today, challenging the Marxist view of man, among countless other articles, such as the ones that you see in God in the Dock and The Weight of Glory. By 1943, the Screwtape Letters were published in America, and it was an absolute sensation. Letters started pouring across the Atlantic and flooding the kilns. In 1947, miracles hit the States, and more letters landed on the shore of Britain. Jack's popularity in America was undeniable and showed no signs of abating. The September issue of the Atlantic Monthly featured an article, C.S. Lewis, Apostle to the Skeptics, by University of Wisconsin English professor Chad Walsh. The excitement over this article, and you see it right here, C.S. Lewis, Apostle to the Skeptics. In fact, do I have a little pointer on this? I thought I had a little laser pointer, because if I do, I'm going to use it. I'm going to wear y'all out with it. I'm going to figure out how to make that happen. But right here you see the article, C.S. Lewis, Apostle to the Skeptics by Chad Walsh. This article captured the attention and the affections of so many Americans who were readers of the Atlantic Monthly that Eva Walsh, Chad Walsh's wife, said, you know what? You ought to turn your article into a book. And Chad Walsh actually goes to Oxford to meet with C.S. Lewis in the summer of 1948, and he discovered that Jack was working on 2 books, Surprised by Joy, that we've mentioned a fair amount the first couple of Thursday nights together, and a, quote, children's book in the vein of Edith Nesbit. You may be familiar with Edith Nesbit and the Railway Children. Well, he did complete that in that book, and then in September 1947 issue of Time magazine, everyone who passed a newsstand could see for themselves, many the first time, who is this enigmatic figure who is capturing the imagination of believer and unbeliever alike. The caption here at the bottom of the magazine, on the cover of Time magazine, Oxford's C.S. Lewis, His Heresy, Christianity. The article inside the magazine was entitled Don versus Devil. He was an Oxford Don. It's a way of speaking of an Oxford professor. Don versus Devil, in which Lewis is listed alongside a growing list of public intellectuals such as T.S. Eliot, Dorothy Sayers, W.H. Auden, Graham Greene, who all professed belief in Christianity. All this attention meant that Warney went to work overtime on his little royal typewriter, replying to all the letters that were inundating the kilns. You see this is actually the typewriter that every one of Lewis's letters, which appear over here in these 3 fat volumes, this is the little typewriter on which every one of those letters was typed. Lewis didn't type. Warney typed. 2 fingers, but he typed. He did it with 2 fingers, but he was better at typing than Lewis was. And so Lewis would write out his manuscripts in longhand, and Warney would type them out. He would write out his letters in longhand, and Warney would type them, or he would simply dictate his letters, his replies to Warney, and he would type them. And so this flood of letters is coming in, and he answers every single one of them, at least briefly. It was an amazing thing. I can't even keep up with my email. Some of y'all know I struggle with email. I mean, my goodness, and yet he's taking the time to reply with this slow, tedious process of writing and typing letters from doctors, professors, both sides of the Atlantic, children, and other grateful readers. In fact, before the 3-volume collection of the complete letters of Lewis came out, the collection of children's letters was published here, C.S. Lewis's Letters to Children. I don't have time to read many, but I just want to give you kind of an example of the way that he would take time to respond. Dear Patricia, all your points are innocence, right? But I'm not exactly representing the real Christian story and symbols. I'm more saying, suppose there were a world like Narnia and it needed rescuing, and the Son of God or the great emperor overseas went to redeem it as he came to redeem ours. What might it in that world all have been like? Perhaps it comes to much the same thing as you thought, but not quite. 1, the creation of Narnia is the Son of God creating a world, not specifically our world. Jadis, number 2, plucking the apple is like Adam's sin, an act of disobedience, but it doesn't fill the same place in her life as his plucking did in his. She was already fallen, very much so, before she ate it. 3, the stone table is meant to remind one of Moses' table, the law of God. Right? Remember, Aslan basically is sacrificed on the stone table. Jesus is sacrificed, as it were, because of our disobedience to the law. The law crushes sinners or Christ in their stead. All right? 4, the passion and resurrection of Aslan are the passion and resurrection of Christ, as it might have happened in that world. Edmund is like Judas, a sneak and a traitor, etc. He keeps going on, this careful detail explaining to children when they write to tell him how much they love the Chronicles of Narnia, and he writes them back answering all their questions in detail. It really is a precious thing to read, and you can access, well, that's out of print, and Volume 3, which is where a lot of these Narnia letters are going to be, is out of print as well. You can get Volume 3 on the used market. Volumes 1 and 2, I think, are still available strangely, but Volume 3 is not. I don't get it. Anyway, more than letters. Given the stark reality of rationing in England during the war, life was grim. Even potatoes were scarce. Only the upper crust could obtain such delicacies as potatoes, as we hear Pippin, or is it Mary who said that? After the war and the lifting of the blockade, American admirers started sending all sorts of goodies to express their gratitude. Luxuries, to be exact. Dr. Warfield M. Farrar, professor of surgery at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore in 1945, started sending everything from writing paper to cheese, chicken, sardines, lard, syrup, butter, and on top of all of it, ham. Jack was so grateful for that ham that he wrote back on October 1st, 1947, quote, such a thing couldn't be got on this side of the Atlantic unless one was very deep in the black market. Months later, reflecting on another delivery of ham, he wrote on March 2nd, 1948, quote, the arrival of that magnificent ham leaves me just not knowing what to say. If it were known that it was in my house, it would draw every housebreaker in the neighborhood more surely than would a collection of gold plates. Of course, Jack and Warnie, being Jack and Warnie, couldn't keep all of these luxuries, all this bounty just for themselves, as more parcels and gifts arrive from grateful readers in the States, more hams from Dr. Farrar, more cheese, all the things. Jack made sure that all these items were shared with the servants at Magdalen College and his fellow Inklings. The Inklings started calling themselves the hamsters, because this ham kept coming over. And they would indulge in these hams, always, they said, with an enamel jug of beer on the table that they could drink with that ham. And Jack and Warnie would take all of these things into Jack's rooms at Magdalen College, and for the Inklings, he would hide them under the blanket on his bed. And they couldn't see what it was, just, packages, and they could point to one and have it, but they couldn't know what it was ahead of time. It might be something as wonderful, one of them said, as a tin of tobacco, or something as dreadful as a can of prunes. But the point is, he was sharing. He wasn't going to keep all of it. Even in the days of rationing, when no one could get anything. And if you've ever studied rationing in post-war England, it really is a stark existence. And yet he couldn't keep all of these delicacies to himself that were coming across the Atlantic. Well, before we move into a discussion of the way to glory, I want to try to compress in as small a frame as possible in just a few brief minutes here what are to me a crucial, if dark, season of Jack's life. Writing was always his pleasure and his escape. He told Arthur Greeves, upon learning that Greeves was ill, to take up writing as, quote, ink is the great cure of all human ills, as I have found out long ago. By February of 1949, he was halfway through writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, only to be faced with Warnie's alcoholism increasing to the point that Jack had to have him admitted to the Auckland nursing home to draw out. Warnie was back at the kilns within a month and wrote in his diary that Jack seemed to blame his alcoholism not just on the addiction, but on spirits attacking him. And so Jack, was trying to be compassionate. He was trying to care for his brother. Probably wasn't facing just the depth of his chronic alcoholism. Warnie spoke of leaving the warm environs of the nursing home and returning to the cold, dank kilns, made all the more unbearable by the presence of Mrs. Moore, who berated him upon return over the scarcity of coal, as well as suggesting that his cure that he had just gotten at the nursing home, drying out for a month, that his cure wasn't going to last. Warnie said that he tried to pray that first night back home, only to find the line dead. Like picking up a phone and the line is dead. Lewis busied himself working on The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Magician's Nephew, and Prince Caspian. Dr. Farrar, whom Jack affectionately dubbed Farrar of the Hams, made a trip to visit Jack in Oxford. He found Jack's health disconcerting. Warnie got into a heated exchange with Minto, with Mrs. Moore, and insisted that Jack needed an extended break, an actual vacation, and that she was going to have to release him from waiting on her hand and foot every single day of his life so that Jack could get a break and try to heal. He said he frightened her into agreeing. On June 16, 1949, Warnie proposed a true vacation to Jack, back to Ireland. In his surprise, Jack readily agreed and said, I need that. Lewis wrote to his friend Arthur Greeves and told him to expect him. Yet during these months, Warnie started drinking heavily again. The reason that he started drinking heavily again was because he couldn't bear the thought that with Jack gone, the care of Mrs. Moore was going to fall on his shoulders. And so he went on a drinking bender. And that drinking bender, of course, meant that Jack couldn't go to Ireland. He couldn't take his trip. Jack begged him to return to the nursing home, but Warnie refused. Warnie ended up having to be assigned to an asylum for a season. Jack reached out to his friend and eventual biographer, George Sayer, in desperation as to how to help his brother Warnie, determining, as he said to Sayer, that he was likely going to have to confront him and this time show his teeth to get his attention. Dr. Farrar reached out to Jack and invited him to come to the States to stay in his cabin in the Rockies in Cody, Wisconsin. Another fan, Mrs. Vera Matthews of California, also sent a letter offering to put him up. Jack replied on November 7th, 1953, "You think that streamlined planes and trains would attract me to America. What I want to see there is yourself and 3 or 4 other good friends. After New England, the Rip Van Winkle Mountains, Nantucket and the Huckleberry Finn Country, the Rockies, Yellowstone Park, and a subarctic winter. And I should never come if I couldn't manage to come by sea instead of air, preferably on a cargo boat that took weeks over the voyage. I'm a rustic animal and a maritime animal, no good at great cities, big hotels and all that. I'd love to see a bear, a snowshoe, and a real forest." By August of 1949, Jack was busy writing The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. It was during this time also that the Thursday evening Inklings meeting dissipated and remained from that point forward a Tuesday lunch gathering at the Eagle and Child as it had for many, many years. Jack had begun a series of Latin letter correspondence. This is really a special thing here. The Latin letters of C.S. Lewis. Father John Giovanni Calabria had read the Screwtape Letters, a translation of the Screwtape Letters. He couldn't read English, but he wanted to correspond with Lewis. Lewis wanted to work on his Latin, And so he started corresponding with Father Giovanni Calabria, just so he could practice his Latin, and they could correspond with one another. And in many ways, Father Giovanni became something of a spiritual guide for Lewis. This is the actual, not Lewis's, but this is an example of the Latin dictionary that Lewis kept on his desk. It's the elementary Latin dictionary by Oxford University Press that Lewis would have kept on his desk as he crafted his Latin letters. But he wrote to Father Giovanni, again, he was of Veroia of the Poor Servants of Divine Providence in Verona. Jack confessed to Father Giovanni his fear about growing older, the frailty that he was feeling, the constant feuding between the various women who were being sheltered at the kilns. Of course, there was a female gardener, there was Mrs. Moore, after whom he styled the White Witch and the Lion Witch in the Wardrobe. There were a host of other, others there who were taking shelter, and they were constantly feuding. And he wrote to Father Giovanni, and speaking of Mrs. Moore as his, quote, aged mother, isn't that interesting? Whose infirmity required his daily care. He told Father Giovanni that with all of the feuding between the women who lived at the kilns at the time, that he was living in the tents of Kedar, from Psalm 124 and 5. Quote, a warrior sharp arrows the growing coals of the broom tree. Woe to me that I sojourn in Meshech, that I dwell among the tents of Kedar. Too long have I had my dwelling among those who hate peace. So, he's trying to be a peacemaker with everybody living at the kilns, and he just couldn't do it. Jack wrote to Dr. Farrar of his fears of old age. Dr. Farrar had taken a real medical interest in Jack's health from across the Atlantic. He wrote to him of his fears of old age and of the Arctic wind of the future catching up to him at age 51. He told Dr. Farrar that, quote, insecurity, war, poverty, pain, unpopularity, and loneliness were being used by God to detach him from the world, and the idea that the tent of the body is actually home. He said that only a few aesthetic men would choose these things if one could avoid it, but it was the end for which we were created in this life. It's kind of similar to what Brad was reading from The Problem of Pain. That pain, as Lewis says, is God's megaphone to arouse us, right? That it reminds us that we're not home yet. He wrote to another frequent correspondent, Sister Penelope, that we must embrace, quote, and I love this, cheerful insecurity in this life, because that's what our Lord asks of us. So he's learning. We're not home yet. There must be a recognition of our insecurity. Life is fragile, and yet there's to be there's to be a joy in the midst of it all. So you see how this all comes together in our Thursday night sessions here, this pursuit of Sehnsucht, of joy. Cheerful insecurity is what our Lord asks of us. But then there was a lady who had been converted through listening to the broadcasts that eventually became Mere Christianity. And she began corresponding regularly with Jack. Her name? Ruth Pitter, of course. See, you ought to know by now. You ought to know by now. I set y'all up for that. Ruth Pitter, 1897 to 1992. She was a poet with whom Jack became friends. And so he and Owen Barfield arranged to meet her in Chelsea. Jack also invited another lady to this luncheon. And this lady would make an indelible impact on Jack from this point on. Her name? You're not falling for it again, are you? You're not falling for it again. Pauline Baines. 1922 to 2008. Why was she coming to this luncheon? Because she was being interviewed to become the illustrator for a series of books for children called The Chronicles of Narnia. Jack having just finished The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in December of 1949. By April 29th, 1950, having fallen out of bed 3 times in one night, Minto, Mrs. Moore's health, reached a point at which care for her could not continue at the kilns. Jack arranged for her to be admitted to the rest home nearby the kilns. While this created an immediate easement on all who lived at the kilns, it torpedoed Jack's financial situation. He had been planning to visit his friend Arthur Greeves in Ireland in the summer of 1950, but had to write to tell him that once again the axe has fallen and he wasn't going to be able to afford the trip due to the expense of her care, which was over 500 pounds a year. He feared that if she lived for a whole lot longer, he would become destitute and broke. He just wouldn't be able to afford her care. He told his friend Arthur Greeves that he didn't know quite how to feel about her going to the nursing home. Quote, relief, pity, hope, terror, and bewilderment have me in a whirl. I have the jitters. The college gave Lewis a sabbatical, during which time he began to work on Volume 3 of the Oxford History of English Literature, entitled English Literature in the 16th Century, Excluding Drama, 1954. I actually have an original of it back there. I should have brought it down. Despite this monumental achievement, which is still regarded to this day and used in English classrooms, Jack was passed over for the chair of poetry at Oxford, a harbinger of things to come. The gospel does not make for respectability among the elites and the intelligentsia. Jack visited Minto every day until her death, Friday, January 12, 1951, thus ending what Warney called 30 years of self-imposed enslavement. She's buried in the cemetery of Holy Trinity Church, as are Jack and Warney. Jack, now free of his duty, wrote to Arthur Greeves that he was finally coming to Ireland with Warney for a visit, and that he felt so excited that the way he felt, it must be what a cork feels like in a champagne bottle as the wire is being unraveled and being taken off. And then he wrote, "Pop," with an exclamation. He was so excited to go back to Ireland. However, things were not all well. A strange and unknown lady named Mrs. Hooker had taken up lodging at the Court Stairs Hotel run by Allen and Nell in Berners and Price in St. Lawrence in Thanet, Ramsgate, Kent. She told the proprietors that her husband was a famous author, none other than C.S. Lewis, and that all her accounts were to be charged to him, and that he was due to arrive in a few weeks, and when he arrived, he would settle all their accounts. So she enjoyed a 3-month stay in this luxury hotel. In April of 1952, Mrs. Berners Price from the hotel showed up at Magdalen College with a stack of unpaid bills incurred by Jack's wife. Jack told her, "I'm not married." Barfield, again a solicitor, took up his case in court, and Mrs. Hooker wound up receiving free lodging at Holloway Prison, because she had pulled this scam all throughout England a number of times, and now it finally caught up with her. But something for which Jack had longed for throughout his life was about to catch up to him. As a young boy seeking joy, looking at his brother's little cookie tin, biscuit tin, to an atheist seeking joy in all the wrong places, to joy, Jesus, true joy, seeking and finding him on Addison's Walk and in the sidecar of a motorcycle on the way to the zoo, to Jack's writing children's stories about the pursuit of joy, even during these dark years of the 40s and 50s. You ever thought about that? Those joyful little children's stories are coming out of these dark years that I've just described. And yet another joy was about to find him. You remember Chad Walsh's book, 1949, C.S. Lewis, Apostle to the Skeptic? Someone in the States had been greatly impacted by this book, as well as other writings of Lewis. In fact, she owed her conversion to Lewis, her conversion to Christ. This American admirer, this American lady sent a letter. Jack received it January 10th, 1950. And thus begins the rest of our story. And if you want to know more about this American lady, you just got to come back next week. All right, y'all. Let's talk here for a few minutes about the weight of glory. I'm not assuming that everybody's had the time to read it necessarily, but for those of you who have, what struck you? What did you love about the weight of a glory? Again, it's the sermon. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and go back to where that picture is. You see here. Again, preached in that very pulpit there. What did you like about the weight of glory? What are some things that struck you? Well, I tell you what, let me just read a very brief sentence or two here. And this is, in my opinion, one of the most powerful statements in all of Lewis's corpus. The New Testament has lots to say about self-denial, but not about self-denial as an end in itself. We are told to deny ourselves and to take up our crosses in order that we may follow Christ. And nearly every description of what we shall ultimately find, if we do so, contains an appeal to desire. If there lurks in most modern minds the notion that to desire our own good and earnestly to hope for the enjoyment of it is a bad thing, I submit that this notion has crept in from Kant and the Stoics and is no part of the Christian faith. Indeed, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea. We are far too easily pleased. Isn't that incredible? What did you underline in the weight of glory? Or what have you memorized? Or what questions do you have about the sermon, The Weight of Glory? Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, the idea that we transcend nature
Uh-huh.
and that nature, I guess you would say, will pass, but we are immortal.
Sure. So, Lewis, obviously, one of the reasons that Lewis begins to become so popular and people are clinging to his every word is that finally there is someone speaking intelligently and biblically against materialism and the assumption that all we are just random accidental bags of biology. That we are made for more. Even this idea of desire, right? We are created to crave, welcome to want, designed to desire, is because we are made for more. You know, Lewis says, if I find within me this desire that cannot be met in this world, it must mean that I was created for another world. I do a Q&A in this room with the upper school students and in one of the rooms over the middle school every couple of weeks. And yesterday I was doing a Q&A in here. We had about 60 kids packed in here. Up back there where y'all are all sitting, I mean, just a sea of kids back there just firing questions at me. And I tell them every time we start, I say, no spin, no BS, no word salad, only what I have the authority of the Word of God to say. Well, I say, let's go. And they just start firing questions at me. Well, it was interesting. I was doing the middle schoolers over here right before I did the upper school. And this sweet little girl very sincerely said, is it okay for us as Christians to think about heaven? And that gave me the opportunity to say, as Christians, how can we not think about heaven? And I went through kind of church history and different people who extolled the beauties of thinking about heaven. Meditation on the Future Life, John Calvin, 1509 to 64. But C.S. Lewis wrote a lot about heaven. In fact, the Chronicles of Narnia, like any good story, are a story about finding our way home. And in many ways, The Weight of Glory, The Weight of Glory is sort of the theological substructure for adults. It's a sort of theological substructure for the children's stories that we know as the Chronicles of Narnia. If you want to know what Lewis is trying to get kids to wrap their little hearts around in the Chronicles of Narnia, it's in this sermon right here. Other thoughts or observations about the weight of glory? Yeah, so eternality is the final experience of glory. You know, he says, you've never met a mere mortal. You know, you see somebody next to you and they sing off key or they have a double chin or their shoes squeak. He said, you've actually never met a mere mortal. If you could see the glory that's going to be revealed in your neighbor, you would be tempted to all but fall down and worship them. And so it's a way of taking the dignity of the Imago Dei in humanity very seriously, not just in the here and now, but the trajectory toward on which we find ourselves and the glory that is going to be revealed in us. Right? It's Romans 8. all creation groaning under the fallout of the fall, awaiting for the revelation of our adoption as sons. You think, well, wait a second, we're already adopted sons and daughters. What's to wait for? Well, Paul says in Romans 8, the final or the ultimate phase of our adoption as sons is the resurrection body. The resurrection of our bodies from the grave is the ultimate experience of our glorification. And so Lewis thinks about this a lot because of what Brad was talking about earlier and what you heard him saying to Sister Penelope and Father Giovanni, that it feels like the trials that we experience are meant by God and sent by God to remind us that we're not home yet, that this tent, this earthly body, is not our final home. Well, that's not Lewis, that's Paul. That's the Apostle Paul to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 15. And so for Lewis, many of his writings are suffused with a dignifying take on the human. And by dignifying take on the human, I don't mean what he would have found among the liberal intelligentsia of his day, the modernist idea that man is this evolved and evolving creature who is bettering himself. I mean, good grief. All that modernist nonsense got torpedoed by the First World War. And then a few years later, another world war that utterly dismantled. It was the final Jenga block coming out of the modernist project. And what rose out of the ashes was postmodernism. Well, where are we now? Postmodernism is giving way to metamodernism. The metamodernists are looking at the postmodernists saying the postmodernists were right in their critique of the modernists for having such an elevated view of man as an evolving, technologically advancing creature, doesn't need God, as Nietzsche says, Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, as Friedrich Nietzsche said, God is dead, God remains dead, and we've killed him. So we've outgrown our need for God, and now the modern man is rising up. That's what fueled the atheism and the agnosticism of Lewis's day. Well, when modernism gets torpedoed by two great wars, suddenly the optimism that people have in man as an advancing creature takes a big hit. The postmodern project takes over and says, the modernists were wrong in their belief in a meta-narrative. The modernists were wrong in their belief that there was truth. Of course, truth is not Christianity, but truth was out there. The idealists were saying, it's you and me, the absolute within you and me. That's the big truth now. It's not Christianity, but there's a big truth. The postmodernists are saying, you guys are wrong, you modernists. There is no big truth. We're all just, subjective opinions, you and I. And so what we've experienced now over the last probably 8 to 10 years, in at least on boots on the ground now, is the dismantling of the postmodernist project. The metamodernists are looking at the postmodernists saying, y'all were right in your critique about the modernists, but you postmodernists never came up with a solution. The metamodernist has the solution. Man has evolved as man, and it's now time to go beyond man. Well, that's nothing new. Friedrich Nietzsche said that. Again, 1844 to 1900. Friedrich Nietzsche said, I give you the Übermensch. Man is still just an ape and a worm. He needs to evolve beyond being a man. Well, the metamodernist is saying, that's right. We've got to go to the next phase of evolution where we evolve beyond this thing we are now, human, and we transcend humanness. And it's going to be technology that does it for us. And so we're going to upload our consciousness into the cloud, and AI is going to do all of our thinking for us. So transhumanism. Why am I going down this rabbit hole? Because of your question. C.S. Lewis, all of his writings, The Weight of Glory, which is, as I would like to say, the theological substructure of the Chronicles of Narnia. Again, when he preached it, he was writing the Chronicles of Narnia. So this, in some ways, is this theological manifesto, this sermon, that again gets told in story form in the Chronicles of Narnia. But it was not just in the Chronicles of Narnia that he does it. I was talking with somebody earlier. We share a favorite series by Lewis, the Ransom trilogy, or the Space Trilogy, as you know it. Because Lewis is infusing all of his writings, having left his atheism and come into an embracing of Christianity. He realizes not just what is true about Jesus Christ, but what is true about himself and his fellow man. That we are created, imago Dei, destined, endowed with great dignity and destined for glory if we put our faith and trust in Christ. And so he actually suffuses not just Narnia and the weight of glory and the abolition of man and any number of other things, but even the space trilogy he infuses with this trajectory of where man is going and the glory that's going to be revealed in the human being. And that was a shot across the bow against the atheism and the materialism of his day. In fact, the space trilogy was written in response to the atheism and the naturalism of H.G. Wells. And as I've told you before, in the final of the three in the space trilogy, That Hideous Strength, Lewis laments when he says, the last aspect of nature that man will overcome is human nature. Then the battle will be won. The only question that remains will be, who will have won the battle? And he's saying that to say, if we don't capture a vision for man as created by a glorious God destined for glory, then what we're going to have, and this was in That Hideous Strength, 47, 48, or 45, he published that. What he was doing in That Hideous Strength was actually prophesying metamodernism, and he didn't even know it. But the answer in all of these things is this idea of a man moving toward glorification. But that only happens not through personal advancement or some kind of absolute ideal, but through Jesus Christ. As he says in Mere Christianity about the resurrection, the resurrection has opened a door that cannot be closed. It's thrown open a window. It's opened a door that cannot be closed. And he says, and we are all like statues, you and I, but there's a rumor going around that one day we are going to come to life. And that's the glory that he's talking about there. So, all right, y'all. Time for, Brad, did you have a thought?
Just one quick thought is that
I'm going to hand the mic over to you here, so everybody can hear that golden voice.
I believe it's more in Mere Christianity than it's a way to glory, but the concept of we thirst because there's water. He doesn't say it exactly that way. We hunger because there's food. We
Yeah.
long for heaven because heaven exists.
Yeah.
I think of the Great Divorce, that the red lizard, on the shoulder was just one of my favorite things because, the postmodern man or modern man, you overcome these things, or you outgrow these things, but in Lewis's conception of it, you take that thing that's potentially the greatest weakness becomes the thing you would ultimately ride into heaven. That's God's way, is to take up what is weak
Yeah.
and makes it our pathway, which fits into the whole concept of pain and suffering.
Yeah.
How he uses those things, which to me, and I think of the scripture that says we grieve not as those who have no hope. Because of Christ, we do have hope. Hope in what?
Yeah.
That we will see them again, that heaven does exist.
Yeah.
And that there is an ultimate conclusion to the matter. And
Yeah.
to me, that's the beauty of C.S.
That's
Lewis.
the beauty of it.
He brought that to my attention.
Yeah. That's why, Brad, I like to tell people, Jonathan Edwards gives me an example of somebody who preached the Christian worldview. Cornelius Van Til makes it intellectually impossible that I can ever doubt the Christian worldview. And it's C.S. Lewis who makes me want to believe it's all true.
Yeah.
Those very reasons. Yeah, Lynn.
Have you announced about David Payne being at TPAC next weekend?
Oh, my goodness, no. Hand this back to Lynn. We need to hear this.
David
Y'all want to hear this?
David Payne, who is a very good friend of mine from England, it personifies C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
He is amazing.
Amazing.
He's at TPAC next weekend. Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, maybe even Sunday. But it's just look up TPAC and it'll tell you about it if you want to go see. We're going.
Which one of his shows is he doing? Is it an evening with C.S. Lewis?
I think it's the evening.
Okay, if you've not seen An Evening with C.S. Lewis, you owe it to yourself. It would be a great
It's gonna be
way.
just like it. When you,
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
You owe it to yourself. It'd be a great way to cap off this little series that we've done is to go see that show. You'll think you're there. He's amazing. So it's just amazing. You really owe it to yourself to go see that show. You won't regret it. All right. Yeah. Oh yeah. Si?
I said it's actually Christmas with C.S. Lewis.
Oh, this is Christmas with C.S. Lewis. Okay. There you go. All right. Well, it'd be a great way to supplement what we're doing here. We have one more night. That's next Thursday night. What I want you to do in prep for next Thursday night is start reading A Grief Observed. you probably can understand why you're going to read that, and what most of what we're going to talk about next week is going to be about is his marriage to Joy Davidman, the sorrow that filled his heart, and his own death. And that's going to leave us at a place where we will then read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe over the Christmas break. And then we'll come back in February, and we're going to spend a couple of weeks in Narnia, a couple of weeks with Ransom on this strange planet in the space trilogy, and we're going to consider for a couple of weeks Mere Christianity. I'm going to give you a little homework next week, just a video for you to go watch that will help frame your understanding of the Chronicles of Narnia, and I think it'll be a fun read, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe over the Christmas break. So next Thursday night, 6:30, and yeah, go online and get your tickets for Christmas with C.S. Lewis.